Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine put together by us here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. You can find us online at tertiumquids.org. I understand there's a YouTube channel all the kids are using these days, but, I put the Lud in Luddite. So for the most part, it's a rotary telephone and a tubeless transmitter for us here at Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Our first guest this week has been watching the hair on fire behavior regarding the nomination of Judge Brett Kavanaugh to the U.S. Supreme Court. It just released a poll as if somehow public polling had anything to do, and I'm sure it's meant to influence senators that might be looking at voting yay or nay for Judge Kavanaugh, is that only 41% of Americans support the nomination of Brett Kavanaugh. And joining us to get into the Supreme Court and all of what's being said about it, from InfluenceWatch.org and Capital Research, he's Hayden Ludwig, research associate there. He's got a new article out debunking the left's hysteria at the Supreme Court. Hayden, welcome to the program. How are you doing, sir?
Thanks, Joe. I'm well. Thanks for having me.
Not at all. I cannot recall. I mean, there have been individual fits and starts, and certainly the Clarence Thomas circus and the craziness over Robert Bork. But for the most part, we go through some talking points and some camera time. But this seems like an unprecedented period of time regarding rhetoric, regarding Supreme Court nominees and things that they, quite honestly, as far as I can tell, can't do.
Well, that's absolutely right. And a good way to look at it is we are reliving a lot of the Robert Bork stuff. It's like we've had deja vu all over again. In fact, we've already tracked 2 out of the 3 groups that are taking the lead in trying to stall, if not outright derail, the confirmation of Mr. Kavanaugh are the same groups back from 1987 when Mr. Bork was up for consideration.
Really? Still around?
Still around. We're talking about People for the American Way, Alliance for Justice, and a brand new one, Demand Justice. These 3 groups put together are basically the 3 professional left-wing groups that want you to think that all their protesting is completely spontaneous and grassroots, which is why they hold up glossy pre-printed signs the night that Brett Kavanaugh is chosen by the president and nobody else knows about it before that.
Yeah, I think you have some pictures on your website of people with signs saying oppose with a big white field, and then they ran around and wrote in magic marker Kavanaugh's name and Gorsuch's name. It's funny, I guess, if you want to look professional, I guess they almost look like the stickers you get at the beginning of a conference. Hi, my name is. You're right. This costs a lot of money.
I actually went to a couple of these protests and misfortune to attend these things to cover them. And the first time around, they did have the big fill in the blank with whomever we decide to protest here, because they really don't care if it's Kavanaugh or anybody else. If you listen to the Center for American Progress, one of the lead groups on this, they were tweeting a full 3.5 hours before the president decided on Judge Kavanaugh that he was too extreme to occupy Anthony Kennedy's seat.
Even though he was a clerk for Anthony Kennedy, if I'm not mistaken about his career, right?
Oh, that's right. I mean, it ultimately comes down to the same kind of tactics. And we can see this, by the way, in their latest their protest they had on July 9th. Give you an example. We went there and we saw pre-printed glossy signs that said things like, "Stop Barrett, stop Kethledge, stop Kavanaugh," referring to all the potential shortlist of nominees that the president might have chosen. So it was just really take your pick. Yeah.
Stop everybody. Stop anyone and everyone. Is this one of these, and I don't want to say anarchist because I think that gives them too much gravity. Is this just sort of almost a reparational group that wants to create what I refer to as conflating special treatment, preferential treatment with justice? We want justice, but I only want my kind of justice. I don't want the actual kind of justice where the statue has to be blindfolded and holds a scale. I just want justice to make me feel better about myself.
Well, yeah, Yeah, and if you look at the groups I mentioned, especially People for the American Way, this is an old group started in the late 70s, early 80s by Norman Lear, sitcom producer, and essentially it's grown into such a far-left organization that anybody that doesn't believe in essentially almost Soviet-style socialism, or what they like to call democratic socialism, which is just where you vote in your oppressors instead of them taking over, you're an extremist and a Nazi. And actually, matter of fact, I watch, and I would encourage your listeners to watch the old 1987 video that People for the American Way put out protesting Judge Bork, narrated by Gregory Peck, calling Bork a racist defender of poll taxes and whites-only sign. Then you had the famous Ted Kennedy coming up and telling everybody that if Robert Bork's America comes to pass, women will be forced into back-alley abortions.
Yeah, and they will have separate restaurants for the coloreds to eat. But it's amazing to me. He's considered a lion of the intellectual, and you listen to the speech and you think, my gosh, that's actually worse than anything even Dianne Feinstein says these days.
Well, it's true, and these are the types of people though that stand for precedent and the Supreme Court. And are the stoic defenders of the Supreme Court until, they're no longer the ones in power of it. If you go back to Roe v. Wade, that's the major talking point right now, that Judge Kavanaugh, is going to overturn Roe v. Wade. And, of course, he's not allowed to do such because that would be overturning precedent.
Right.
Except, of course, that Roe v. Wade turned over all precedent back in the 1970s.
Of course it did. Well, why would you want consistency, Hayden? Let me ask you, before we get into the specifics of things like Roe v. Wade and that sidebar to it as well, is there a certain Alinskyite rule book that's being applied here as you go to these events and you see this going on at Influence Watch, and you're looking at people who are saying they're going to weaponize the law against this, that, or the other thing? Saul Alinsky said, well, take what you're going to do and accuse your opponents of it, and then you've taken the high ground on it. It almost seems like this is what they do, and then they accuse conservative judges of doing it.
I agree with that. I think that's true. I'd be hesitant to say that it's explicitly Alinskyite, but what I would say is that this bears all the hallmarks of the professional left. You can see it in the funding. We at Influence Watch and Capital Research Center, our specialty is tracing the flow of money to these activist organizations. We find behind the big three that are protesting this, we find money from George Soros's Open Society Foundation, from the Ford Foundation, Service Employees International Union, you name it. Groups that are at the forefront of every professional left-wing movement are the same groups funding this. And those groups are all absolutely influenced by Saul Alinsky's organizing tactics, just as you saw the campaigns that brought Barack Obama to power. Same kind of organizations rallying around, if you do not agree with us, you're a Nazi, you're extremist, and you're not allowed to take power.
Someday I want to find all these white supremacist groups and prove that they're connected to them, just to sort of create the exemplar, look, you're with them, because, just pretend you're against us for a while, and then we can damn anyone. We had, of course, here in Virginia, the Unite the Right rally with a bunch of National Socialists. I refer to the riots of last August in Charlottesville as Marx Brothers Weekend, as in you had Marxists inside the park and Marxists outside of the street, and they were just spraying each other with pepper spray. But beyond that, you bring up a great point that these groups are funding them. And if you look at what the Open Society and especially SEIU, these are groups that want nothing less than to just keep everyone in that same level of poverty. That way they can sort of create aid groups and aid coalitions. They don't want to see a society that allows somebody to achieve more. These are the same groups that align against things like Uber and Airbnb, because heavens forbid you make some money on the side, or you can create a hustle where you can make your own money. They all of a sudden want to unionize Uber.
Absolutely right. I come from California, where my friends were always shocked to know that the biggest lobbyist, at least in the couple of years that I was there back then, the biggest lobbyist was the California Teachers Association. My liberal friends are always shocked by that. But, of course, it makes sense when you think that if before this latest Janus versus AFSCME case anyway, you were forced to pay into this organization that's inherently political, well, what do you expect they're going to do but use your money for political ends? And they have a lot of money to use.
We're visiting this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio to talk about the Supreme Court nominees. Now, Brett Kavanaugh, Hayden Ludwig from InfluenceWatch.org, where you can go and look at just a laundry list of these groups that are trying to spend big money on pushing the Supreme Court in a more liberal way. Hayden, it's always baffled me. I know George Soros has money, and he short sold the British economy before his organizations helped crash that. I mean, is that the other side of this? Because it almost feels like, where are these folks getting all this money to do this influence? But are they really just sort of banking on the short selling of collapsing some of these economies?
Well, I couldn't speak too much to your latter point, but absolutely it ultimately comes down from a handful of wealthy individuals and wealthy private foundations. I named one of them earlier, the Ford Foundation.
Oh, yeah.
There's also Rockefeller, Carnegie. The short of it that you should know is that it's effectively old capitalists from about 100 years ago who made their fortune, who were fairly conservative, pro-capitalist men usually, and they put their money into a private trust that was ultimately taken over by not even liberals, but true leftists who do not share the fundamental values of the United States. And they now use gobs and gobs of money to finance anything and everything under the sun, like these kinds of protests. So the unfortunate fact of it is while I'm doing this kind of research, there are probably 15, 20 of me on the other side of the political aisle who are significantly well-funded and have the means to pursue this and many other things.
Mm-hmm. It almost, I guess it was about 10, maybe 12 years ago, I read a book where they made the case that some of these foundations like Carnegie and Ford had been taken over by people who not so much were left-wingers, but were afraid that if communists took over, that they would be the first target. So they thought appeasement, like almost the Lyndon Johnson Great Society stuff, would be the best way forward, that we would appease the poor so they wouldn't rise up and then come in and go Che Guevara on us. I don't know if there's any veracity to it, but it certainly made a compelling argument because, as you pointed out, these were all the industrialists of the 19th into 20th century that were sort of funding all the soft-core left-wingers in an effort to keep the hardcore ones from really rising up.
Absolutely. I mean, you see that phenomenon back in the Bill Clinton administration even. I'd encourage anybody who's interested in this subject, take a look at the kind of the birth of the Internet, a little further along than that, but kind of the open implementation of the Internet. And we've got some anecdotal quotes that we love to bandy about here at CRC that, they talked about between the liberal and the true left-wing crowd of the Clinton administration. If the left-wing crowd got its way, the Internet in 25 years might be as big as a few thousand websites, which puts it in real perspective of how they thought.
Yes, but they'd have control over those. Hayden Ludwig is the research associate at the Capital Research Center, but he's also there at InfluenceWatch.org, where they're collecting all the data and lifting the robe, if you will, for all these folks who are pushing underneath the Supreme Court nomination this time around of Brett Kavanaugh. Is there a pop culture connection to Hollywood all of a sudden, mysterious? And I remember when they said they were going to do this biopic on Ruth Bader Ginsburg, but all of a sudden it comes out, and it is almost like I can't pick the right female action star. I'm almost thinking Linda Hamilton from the Terminator movies. I mean, the promos for it make Ruth Bader Ginsburg out to be this sort of superhero. Maybe Gail Godot could play her as a young woman in this movie, because it's that same "in a world where justice must be brought down," and she's out there saying, "Oh, freedom's not in the Constitution, is it?" And that kind of stuff. Is that Hollywood trying to taint the field a little bit in this, at least in the Vox Populi?
Oh, I think there's a lot to it. If you really look at the conservative right and the liberal left in this country, you don't see co-equal opposites, what you see is one side controls the media, controls the universities, and controls culture, and the other side is, well, America, right? And so you have these two different sides that are fighting wars against each other in which one side has strengths, the other one simply cannot. Give you an example. Talk radio is a huge bonus to the right. But going back to your original point here, absolutely. I mean, when it comes down to it, you're talking about a side that ideologically is perfectly okay with talking about saving the world and wanting to see itself as the defenders of Earth, destroying global warming before it destroys us. And yet you've got Leo DiCaprio flying his best friends on private jets to Davos in Switzerland to receive his environmentalist awards because he's such a defender of the world order.
Right. He doesn't want you to be able to fly around, but him, he's special. And that really comes down to it, Hayden. And you're younger than I am, but we've been around this block so many times. It really comes down to there was a piece just this week about in the New York Times. It was Thomas Friedman talked about how great China was because there was really like a dozen people who make all the decisions as to how the cities are designed and what buildings are going to look like and how efficient that system is. And it just dumbstrikes me that somebody at the New York Times still cuts this guy a paycheck.
I don't remember who said it. It was before my time, but I love the guy who said that inside every left-winger, there's a little Pol Pot just waiting to get out.
That's right. I've been right all along, and if I could just force you to listen to me. Hayden, let's go into the Supreme Court in some more specificness. You mentioned earlier on, obviously, the scary rhetoric where you hear Whoopi Goldberg saying egregious things about where Donald Trump and Jeff Sessions and Brett Kavanaugh want to crawl up parts of her body and I'm sorry, it just sometimes I have a difficult time continuing sentences after thinking about that. But the rhetoric all seems to swirl around Roe versus Wade, or as the left likes to call it, my reproductive rights. And certainly the judicious ones, the ones with law degrees, say, "Oh no, it's a right to choose." It's not. But the real rhetorical ones like to say it's a woman's reproductive rights. What is the reality of what Brett Kavanaugh's ascension to the Supreme Court would mean for Roe v. Wade? Because I know some conservatives that are up in arms about Brett Kavanaugh's nomination.
Sure. Well, I mean, the first rule of thumb is if you control the way you can talk about an issue, you have enormous power, which is why they don't want to call it abortion on demand, which is effectively what the main party platform regarding this issue is on that side. But to your point with Brett Kavanaugh, look, there's no case that I know of that's currently going through, and I'm not a legal scholar, but there's no case going through related to Roe v. Wade. Now, there could be down the road, we're talking about many decades, but even if there were one to go through that would overturn what legal scholars already recognize is a flimsy right to abort your child, even if that went through, what it would effectively mean is not criminalizing abortion like Elise Hogue at the NARAL Pro-Choice America likes to say. It would in fact mean that it goes back to states. Now, like I said before, I'm from California. California is not going to lose its abortion, quote-unquote, rights if Roe v. Wade is brought down the toilet. It simply means they can't force Alabama or Oklahoma to have the same standards as California. It goes back to the 10th Amendment and states' rights issues. That's all.
And the conflating it as a Fourth Amendment security and in privacy has always been seemingly a little bit of a stretch from where I sat. Anyway, what do you make? And there are conservatives, given his rulings in the past about privacy issues and homeland security and FISA and that kind of thing, that are concerned with him from a conservative's point of view, that he sort of laid the groundwork. Though I've read the decision that everyone claims was Justice Roberts' seed for the way he ruled on the Affordable Care Act. I don't see it. I think it's a stretch, but then again, I'm not a lawyer. But there are conservative groups that are very up in arms about Judge Kavanaugh being nominated. Is this the president, in your view, nominating somebody that both sides will have something to say about, and that honestly the left has less less reality to base it on than the right does, and then coming with somebody more attuned with a conservative viewpoint. You mentioned some of the other nominees, or somebody even we haven't heard from yet?
Well, I certainly think that the president, as in all things, is hedging his bets and reading the field very well. If nothing else, President Trump has shown himself to be a man who's capable of learning and outwitting his opponents better than anybody else I've seen on the playing field. Speaking to Mr. Kavanaugh's point, I would say that right now, whatever qualms anybody has about Justice Brett Kavanaugh as opposed to, say, Amy Coney Barrett, remember, too, that this is the kind of situation that's ideal for conservatives who support Kavanaugh. What I mean is there are a third of the senators up for re-election this year, and many of those are Democrats, and many of those are in red states like Indiana and West Virginia.
Oh, yeah,
the situation
absolutely.
he's effectively created means that if I'm a Democrat from a red state who votes for Kavanaugh, I've proven to all Democrats everywhere I can't be trusted. But if I vote against the guy, I essentially vote against my entire state. So I'm in a bad situation regardless of what I do.
I wanted to take a moment to talk with you a little bit about Influence Watch, because even beyond just this Supreme Court nomination where we see how they're funding these battles, we hear a lot, especially with the president's visit in Moscow or in Helsinki with Vladimir Putin, and how they were supposedly influencing our election. And then we find out that this Internet Research Agency is actually one of the biggest funders behind the no pipeline movements because it benefits Russian natural gas providers. I get all of that. Are there surprises? If somebody has never been to influencewatch.org, what are two or three really surprising revelations you guys have been able to unearth in terms of who's paying for what and how?
That's a great one. I'll give you one, somewhat tangential to your main point here, but the Funders Committee for Civic Participation is one group that we've alighted upon that I haven't seen anybody else significantly talk about. There's certainly groups who've mentioned them.
I love their name, by the way. Their name just gives me a chill.
It sounds like something the Stasi would come up with, doesn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, the Funders Committee, as they affectionately refer to themselves as, it's essentially a trade group or an affinity group for wealthy or influential left-wingers from any big union you can think of, any big foundation, any wealthy giver, it doesn't matter. They're all part of this, and the whole point of it is to organize spending habits from each of these people and each of these groups to activist organizations that are trying to vote mobilize or get out the vote. So these people are actually organizing to help the United States Census Bureau reach as many people as they possibly can in the 2020 census, which effectively comes down to, do we count illegal aliens? Mm-hmm. Do we count homeless people who are not registered? So you can see why this would benefit blue states that have a huge amount of these people living there.
Well, I know what their logo can look like since their initials are FCCP. I know there's a lot of CP shirts around that they could just add a little line to it and make it look like an F. Hayden, I love this website. If you share nothing else this weekend, and I know so many of you have done your own hashtag walk away. I know people are claiming that's a fraud being put forth by conservatives to make Democrats think that there's this wave of people leaving the party. But truth, everyone I know that's done walk away, they've walked away from Facebook. But however you share this kind of stuff, share influencewatch.org with them. And thank you so much for taking some time out with us this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.
Thanks, Joe. Appreciate your time.
And make sure you look up his article, Debunking the Left's Hysteria at the Supreme Court. Coming up next, he has actually drained a swamp. Granted, it was New Zealand's swamp. Maurice McTigue from the Mercatus Center now was there, did that, and is now telling us about how it is and the bumpy ride that it can be. But it's not as long a ride as you'd think to drain a swamp. Next on Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Welcome back to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine put together by the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. Our next guest is a former minister in New Zealand and now with the Mercatus Center here in D.C., where he teaches economics and works on economic issues with folks. He is Maurice McTigue. Maurice, welcome to the program, sir. How are you doing?
Joe, thank you very much, and I am doing well. And swamp draining is not that easy.
No. Now, you have experience in this, where you were department minister in New Zealand, where you've been trying to do the same thing there. So, as somebody with some experience at it, that statement is not taken lightly, is it?
No, it's not taken lightly, but sometimes we also think that it's too difficult. And therefore don't start. So, Yes, it's possible, and there are lots of places around the world in the last 20 years that have been through major reforms of how the government does business, and it's all been designed to make it more effective first, and to make it less costly, and to produce better results for citizens.
That last part, though, is certainly the most important one, I think, because many, and I would certainly say as in the Western world, most government organizations in the last 50 to 100 years have been started with the best intentions of helping alleviate some sort of issue, either economic or social issue, and it just seems to mission creep away from their original plan.
Yes, and I think that it's also partly historic, where if you go right back to the early beginnings of, say, the United States, governments worked very much on a cash accounting system, so they didn't spend money unless the money was in the treasury first. That's a novel concept. And they had a very clear idea of what it was that they were trying to achieve and how long it would take. And over time, government activity has expanded out into, we fund lots of activities and we don't actually look very carefully at the results. And the results should be looked at in terms of outcomes. So that means how many people did we move out of homelessness rather than how many people did we actually help.
And go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yes. Well, if I just take that as an example, many countries and many cities, states have struggled with the issue of homelessness, and everybody thinks they can understand it. And frequently the government decides that the problem is that there isn't enough low-income housing to be able to deal with people who can't find housing. Yet when you do the research properly and you look carefully at what are the causal factors for homelessness, we find almost invariably that about 70% of homelessness is caused by mental health issues and not by a lack of housing. So if you deal with it by looking to create more housing, you're never ever going to succeed because you're addressing the wrong problem.
Yeah,
so
I see what you
But I say that, understanding the results you want to achieve is the first step in the process. What's the public benefit that's going to flow from this?
Is there a part of this, and homelessness actually is close to home here, where in our flagship city, where we certainly have a well-off professorial class around the University of Virginia, but we have an enormous homelessness problem in the area, and it has been my contention that a policy directed towards one answer, and your statistics bear out to a great degree. So you said 70% of homelessness driven by mental health issues, and then there's 30% that, it's been my experience that there is probably 2 or 3 other factors in that other 30% there. So creating a policy as a form of government and saying we're going to fix homelessness, I've written a law, and now we're going to address homelessness is disingenuous in the fact that there are too many ways. It's like saying I found one pill and everyone who has cancer is going to get this pill and it will cure cancer because it has cured a small segment of the cancers there. We have to treat these things individually, and bureaucracies are generally not very good at that kind of individual behavior, are they?
No, they're not. And part of it I blame on the process of how we allocate funds
Okay.
through the budget process, because when we allocate funds through a budget process, it's very much the allocation of a quantity of money to spend. But more modern budgeting is actually looking at a purchase of results.
Okay.
So instead of helping people who are poor and don't have enough food, the policy should be how many people do we move from dependency to independent living? And that might mean that you have to do more than just give people money to pay for their groceries and food and shelter. You might actually at the same time have to look at why is it that they're in this situation in the first place. Maybe they don't speak the language. Maybe they don't have skills. Maybe they have social problems, or maybe they have dependency problems. But you have to address that issue at the same time as you're helping them, because the goal is you move them from dependency to independent living, not that you're going to keep them in this dependent state for the rest of their life.
True. And it seems sometimes the bureaucracy is more interested in keeping them on that roster rather than moving them off it. So you mentioned changing to a purchase model for that. Explain that out for our listeners, how that works differently than just saying, here was your budget last year and we're going to add 5% this year for cost of living, or however they determine how much larger somebody's budget gets each year.
Probably the best way I can do that is to give you a real-world example from one of my portfolios in New Zealand. And for a period of time, I was the Minister of Employment.
Okay.
So my job was to look after all of the problems for unemployed people and to deal with that. Now, when I became Minister, there were 34 programs that we funded in that department. But we were funding programs and we weren't looking at results. So the first thing that we did was to audit those programs based upon how good are they at getting people back into work. And the focus then became what we can do is improve the employability of people. We can't actually cure unemployment through one department. So by doing that, we were able to cancel 30 of the 34 programs, and instead give the money to the department and say to them, we now expect you to place X number of people back into the workforce. So in the first year, the department was able to put 300% more people into work for 40% less money. And that's because you only funded the things that were very effective at getting people back into work. And it meant that you have to look at some of the real-world problems and what's in the mind of an employer. So it's interesting, but if you look carefully at the challenges for unemployed people and how they're viewed by prospective employers, one of the most important criterion for an employer is how recently has this person worked.
True. No.
And if you've never worked in your life before, it's extremely difficult to get a job. Even if you have a good degree, it's difficult to get a job if you don't have any work history. So part of the solution is to actually provide people with work experience that will enable them to say to employers, yes, I am prepared to work. I am prepared to get up in time every morning and go to work and be there on time and work the full time. So if you do that, you make those people much more employable. Also, you need to look at some of the other challenges. An unemployed person being able to find where there are jobs is a real challenge. You can help with that job search program and help to make them more employable. So what I'm really saying is if you pick out the tools in your toolbox that are most effective at getting the job done and discard the tools that no longer work, you're going to get much better results.
We're visiting this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio with the Vice President of Outreach for the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, Maurice McTigue, also Cabinet Minister in New Zealand, and I was just reading up on the New Zealand miracle that brings you these experiences. And you had mentioned just before that you had been Minister for Employment. And I maybe I hang up too much on the way words are used, but we have an unemployment commission. You had a Ministry of Employment, and maybe it's just the vernacular, but if your job is, the title is you work in the unemployment department, then there's a subtext that that's what you're rewarding, whereas a Ministry of Employment is going to be, just as a business model, more likely to be doing what you're describing, which is helping somebody find that employment.
Yes, I think that it's critically important. And say, for example, you call it's the Department for Unemployment. What it's probably going to do is it's going to make determinations about whether you qualify for unemployment support, what else you qualify for, but it's not actually going to be looking at why are you unemployed and how do we solve that problem. And what we did was turn that on its head and say that the important thing that you can do is to help improve the employability of these people, and then you actually solve the problem. They go and they look after themselves, and their quality of their life improves immeasurably by being able to do that.
Yeah. Is the size of a bureaucracy, because you talk about very specific results. You mentioned the homeless issue, where some are going to be a mental health issue, some can be other issues. That the bigger the more centralized the decision making, the less likely it's going to be able to handle an individual issue, and the more autonomy you give local offices of those bureaucracies, the better the results, because the more they can tailor them to the individual, not even just a community, but the individuals within it.
Yes. So the government is going to make decisions about problems that it sees in society and things that it needs to or thinks it should address. And you need people who are qualified to be able to do that. But the government doesn't necessarily have to be the delivery organization. Mm-hmm. There are many other groups in society that are much more effective at working with people than, say, a government department is. And I bring to mind lots of church groups and lots of other groups that work in society are much more empathetic with the people that they work with than a bureaucracy is. And a bureaucracy is always risk-averse. And it's looking to make certain that nothing happens that they're going to get criticized over. I would much rather that they took some risks and produced some better results, but also expect and accept that there will be some failures. Because if we don't make failures, we're not actually trying hard enough for successes.
Well, Maurice, let me pick up on that then, on the idea of failure and bureaucracy. If bureaucracies are dictated by elected officials, they seem to be the ones who would be the most likely to be failure adverse, because they don't want to go back to their voters and say, yeah, that didn't work out so well. How do we help our elected officials gain the courage to share the credit and take a flyer on something that could be seen as a failure or an abdication of authority of government?
First, let me say that I think that bureaucrats and politicians are equally risk-averse. Mm-hmm. The bureaucrats are risk-averse because what's at risk is the quantity of funding they're going to get and the size of their empire. So they tend to respond in a manner that's going to make their elected bosses happy and are not as concerned about the clients they serve on a day-to-day basis, which is you and me. Mm-hmm. So the way in which you really change behaviors, in my view, is if you can change what was previously considered to be a success but wasn't really, to a new regime where the decision makers are more likely to be supported in the decision that they're making, because we, the ordinary people, can say, yeah, that makes sense, and that seems to work.
Right.
So one of the adages that we used a lot in New Zealand was stop spending money on things that don't work. And that sounds sort of mind-numbingly stupid, but it is very relevant.
You have to speak to the level, right?
Yes, you do. And one of the problems is that governments tend to be held accountable for how they spend money, but not accountable for what happened as a result of spending the money. So the new philosophy is that we need to change that so that governments are held to be responsible for what happened as a result of spending money. And that means that you have to measure success and you measure costs per unit of success. So if I go back to a very simple analogy, if you want to improve reading, then you don't measure how many children go into remedial reading classes. You measure how many children are now able to read at their biological age as a result of that reading class. And then you hold the officials accountable for how successful are we at getting children up to their biological reading age. And if they're funding activities that have a very low success rate, then those activities have to be terminated.
I agree with you.
And, that makes sense because if one program is able to get 90% of its participants up to the success level of reading at their biological age, and another program gets only 10% of its participants up to that standard, then you have to say that one program is 9 times as successful as the other. And if you fund the poor performing program, that means that 8 out of 10 children don't get to read at their biological age.
Which would be a failure. You would have to call it out for that.
An absolute failure. It makes no sense to the politician or to the bureaucrats to keep that program going. So having the flexibility to consider programs as tools, and you discard an old tool in favor of a new, more effective and efficient tool.
True.
And what you measure then is how much public good did we do? That enables you then to start allocating money on the basis of what do we do very well, instead of presuming that commitment to an activity is measured in terms of how many more dollars we spend.
Well, it says sometimes the existence of the program is considered good in this country, Maurice, and I'm sure you found that. What lesson should the current administration, future administrations, whoever it is that's trying to gain control of this, what are some of the key takeaways from what you had accomplished in New Zealand in a relatively short period of time? When you hear about people, using metaphors like, "Oh, it takes a long time to turn an aircraft carrier around," you guys were able to do a lot in a very short period of time, exemplarily. What lessons should the Americans be taking from what you guys did in New Zealand?
So you need to have something that you can measure success, a reasonable yardstick, and being able to show that the level of educational attainment in the state of, or the Commonwealth of Virginia is continually improving and is now among the best in the country is a good yardstick. And that means that you have to take education piece by piece and say, which areas are we falling behind in? Is it in social skills? Is it in science? Is it in mathematics? Is it in reading or writing? And focus on those and say, how do we lift the performance there?
Okay.
And that then means that you're now starting to make progress. The second thing is you can't just do one thing and decide it's fixed. You have to keep doing things better. And it's like saying, well, I can remember as a young kid actually walking with my father and we were ploughing a field and we were using horses. Now, this was more for the exercise and the enjoyment of using horses, but nobody uses horses any longer.
Right.
Because we found that tractors and advanced machinery were so much better, and we were able to produce so much more. So the old tool is discarded. Not that everybody hated horses.
No.
Most people actually liked them. But they were superseded by plant and machinery that's much more effective. So it's the same when you're looking at government activity. We have to take the best tools that we have available and use those and discard the old ones. Whereas governments tend not to be very happy about discarding old activities.
No, that's true.
They tend to keep them alive. We did an exercise a few years ago here at Mercatus to look at just exactly this kind of issue, but we did a research study back about 2000 on vocational training programs in the federal government. Mm-hmm. We found about 45 of them. The most successful were sort of school-to-work type programs.
Okay.
And they placed somebody into work for about every $500 spent. The least successful was a program that was called the Trade Affected Workers Program, and it cost $29,000 per person placed into work.
What? Oh, my God, that's insane.
Right. Yes. Now, if you actually do the small equation that I mentioned just before, and you say, how many people could we place into work using the most effective program of $500 a person compared to one worker in this other program? And the answer is that it's about 1,600.
Wow.
So every person that you fund in the Trade Affected Workers Program, you're doing at the cost of 1,599 people not getting jobs in other programs.
And that's the kind of thing that has to be brought out, because somebody's saying, well, we're trying. And if we often hear this on the stumps, if just one family has their life improved, isn't that worth it? Not if it's at the cost of 1,599 other ones. What about the establishment of those goals, Maurice? You mentioned that you have to first determine what the goal is of one of these agencies. That seems to be the hardest thing for the American, aid wing of the government to grasp is what is a win for their organization? What is the goal for them? Because it seems like it's and it may be intentional. I don't know.
It's probably organizational cultures about preserving the empire as far as the bureaucracy is concerned. And then as far as the elected representatives, it's not being criticized for taking away something that benefits people. So what you have to be able to show is what's the opportunity cost in economic terms, or what I prefer is what's the benefit foregone by funding something that's ineffective and inefficient. And that then becomes a very valuable tool. And the way that you get there is that in the budget process, there should be a requirement that anybody asking for budget funding had to meet a condition of showing last year's results. What did we achieve with this money last year? And if you give up the same quantity of money or more money in the coming year, what will we achieve? And I think that you need to be looking at those numbers improving all the time. And also that at some stage, the legislators should be able to say, this problem is now fixed and we don't need to fund it any longer. Mm-hmm. So we can shut those things down. Are you ever going to get societal problems to zero? No. But there is a diminishing returns criteria that says that to get the last person placed into a job is going to be infinitely expensive.
It's sort of like Einstein's theory of relativity. The closer you get to the speed of light, the more fuel you have to burn to to get there. But I think the hardest thing is we, the people, have to start saying, if this is a jobs program, is it putting somebody in a job or just spinning wheels? And I guess that's the goal-oriented. Truly, in this country, I always believe it has to come from us. And it sounds like that's what you advocate as well, Maurice, is that it has to come from us because the politicians will just cater to what we seem to reward with our votes.
Yes, I think that's right. And the us, we the people, need to reduce that to pretty simple questions that are quite difficult to answer. And if I go back to saying, don't or stop spending money on things that don't work. So the question is, have you stopped spending money on things that don't work? And if the politician says yes, say, so what things did you stop?
Right.
And by doing that, all of a sudden they have to think about, well, I don't know actually what happened, whether it is working or not. I just know that there's lots of people participate, and that seems to be good, but I don't know whether they get any benefit out of it as an end result. So we used to have a catchphrase that I think was very valuable, and it was this: if the solution is complicated, it's probably wrong.
I love it. Well, we're going to save that. Maurice McTigue, find him at Mercatus.org. It's the economics think tank attached to George Mason University. I'm honored by your presence. I won't even tell you about why we had to have Maurice call back into the radio program for technical reasons, but you're remarkably kind to indulge us that, and I appreciate it. And we hope to have you back very soon. You've been a joy to have on the program, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you very much, Joe.
And thank you all for listening as well. For all of us here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy, I'm Joe Thomas. So long, and thanks for all the